King is dying from wounds that no doctor can explain. They appear every morning, fresh and bleeding, as if something inside him is clawing its way out. When all hope is lost, a 16-year-old girl is brought to the castle, the daughter of a poor widow known for healing ailments of the soul. But as Mercia sits beside the dying king and listens to the confession that spills from his tortured lips, she discovers a truth that will shatter everything she thought she knew about mercy, justice, and forgiveness. 12 years ago, King Aldrich signed a death warrant. The man he executed was innocent, framed by corrupt nobles, and killed without ever being given a chance to defend himself. Now, as the king reveals the name of the man whose blood stains his conscience, Mercia's world stops. Because the merchant he murdered, the father torn from his family and hanged in the village square, was her own father. She is kneeling beside her father's killer, holding his hand, wiping away his tears. And the most terrifying part? Something inside her doesn't want to let go. The king was dying, and no one would say it out loud. That truth hung in the castle corridors like the smell of rotting flesh, unspoken but impossible to ignore. In the great chamber where King Aldrich lay, the silence was broken only by the sound of his fingernails scraping against his own skin, tearing at wounds that refused to heal. The physicians had tried everything: leeches, hot irons, prayers whispered over smoking, incense. Nothing worked. The wound simply appeared each morning, fresh and angry, as if something inside him was clawing its way out. Mercia stood at the edge of the village square, her mother's frail hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. The old woman's eyes were clouded with cataracts, but her voice cut through the morning mist with absolute clarity. "They will come for you today," she whispered, and Mercia felt her stomach twist into a knot so tight she thought she might be sick. "Right there in the mud. When they do, you must go. You must save him." The words made no sense. Mercia was 16 years old, the daughter of a widow who treated heartbreak and melancholy with chamomile tea and long conversations. She knew nothing of kings or castles or mysterious wounds, but her mother's grip tightened until it hurt, and there was something in that pain that felt like prophecy. The royal guard arrived before noon, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that settled on Mercia's dark hair like ash. The captain was a man with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two, and when he looked at her, she saw something she had never seen in a nobleman's eyes before: desperation. "Your mother is Alara the Listener," he said, and it was not a question. "The woman who cures ailments of the spirit." Mercia nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Her mother had earned that title over decades, sitting with the broken and the grieving, helping them untangle the knots in their souls. But Alara was 63 years old now, too weak to travel beyond the village boundaries. "She cannot come," Mercia managed to say, and her voice sounded like a stranger's. "But I can go in her place." The castle was everything she had imagined and nothing she was prepared for. Stone walls that seemed to swallow light. Tapestries depicting battles where men died with their mouths open in silent screams. Servants who moved through the halls like ghosts, their eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding even the possibility of seeing something they should not. Mercia was led through a maze of corridors that smelled of tallow candles and something else, something sour and wrong. When they finally stopped before a heavy oak door, the captain turned to her with an expression that might have been pity. "He scratches himself in his sleep," he said quietly, "every night. We have tried binding his hands, but he fights like a man possessed. The wounds appear by dawn, and by midday they are infected. No physician can explain it. No medicine touches it." The chamber beyond the door was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. It took Mercia's eyes a moment to adjust, and when they did, she wished for the darkness back. King Aldrich lay in a bed large enough for 4 men, but he seemed small against the pillows, diminished. He was 38 years old, she knew, but he looked ancient. His face was gray, his cheeks hollow, and his arms were covered in bandages that seeped with yellow fluid. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath in her chest. They were the eyes of a man who was not sleeping even when he closed them. haunted by something that lived behind his eyelids. "Another charlatan," the king said, his voice rough as gravel. "Come to tell me it is God's punishment or the devil's work or some peasant curse." He did not look at her, kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if there were answers written in the smoke-stained beams. Marcia felt anger flare in her chest, hot and, sudden. She had not asked to be here, had not claimed to be anything more than a girl who knew how to listen. "I am not here to tell you anything," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am here to hear what you have to say." For the first time, King Aldrich turned his head and looked at her. Really looked at her. His eyes were blue, she realized, the color of deep water, and in their depths she saw something that made her heart clench with unexpected recognition. Pain. Not the physical kind that could be soothed with poppy milk and willow bark, but the kind that lived in the marrow of your bones, the kind that woke you in the night and whispered that you deserved every moment of suffering. She had seen that pain before, reflected in her mother's face during the first year after her father died. The kind of pain that came from carrying guilt too heavy for one person to bear. "My mother says that some wounds are not made by blades," Marcia said softly, taking a step closer to the bed. The king's jaw tightened, muscles jumping beneath the gray stubble. "She says that sometimes our bodies show what our hearts cannot speak." She did not know where the words were coming from, only that they felt true, felt necessary. "What is it that your heart cannot speak, Your Majesty?" The silence that followed was so complete that Marcia could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. The king's hands resting on the coverlet began to tremble. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but she saw it. Saw the way his fingers curled into fists, saw the way he pressed them against his thighs as if trying to hold something down, something that wanted desperately to escape. "Get out," he said, but there was no force behind the command. It sounded instead like a plea. "Get out before I say something that cannot be unsaid." Marcia did not move, could not move, because in that moment she understood with terrible clarity that whatever haunted King Aldrich, whatever secret he carried, it was the kind of truth that changed everything. The kind of truth that, once spoken, could never be taken back. And she knew, with the certainty that sometimes comes to the young and foolish, that she was meant to hear it. That her mother had known this would happen, had sent her daughter into the heart of a mystery that might very well destroy them both. "I will come back tomorrow," she said quietly, backing toward the door. "And the day after that, and every day until you are ready to speak the words that are eating you alive from the inside out." She paused at the threshold, her hand on the cold iron handle. "Because whatever you have done, Your Majesty, whatever sin you carry, it cannot be worse than dying like this. Alone, in silence, with your guilt wearing your skin down to nothing." She left before he could respond, but as the door closed behind her, she heard it. A sound so soft she almost missed it. The sound of a grown man beginning to weep. Marcia did not sleep that night. She lay in the small chamber they had given her, a room meant for visiting merchants that smelled of old wood and beeswax, and stared at the ceiling until her eyes burned. Every time she closed them, she saw King Aldrich's face, saw the way his composure had shattered like glass at her final words. She had never spoken to royalty before, had barely spoken to anyone outside her village, and yet something had possessed her in that moment, something that felt bigger than herself, like her mother's voice speaking through her own throat. The castle woke before dawn, and so did she. Servants shuffled past her door carrying buckets of water and armfuls of firewood, their footsteps a rhythm she would come to know by heart. She dressed quickly in the same simple gray wool dress she had worn the day before, the only decent clothing she owned, and tied her dark hair back with a strip of leather. Her hands shook as she worked the knot. What if the king refused to see her? What if yesterday had been her only chance, and she had wasted it by leaving too soon? The questions chased each other through her mind like dogs after a rabbit. But when she arrived at the king's chamber, the guard did not stop her. He simply opened the door, his expression unreadable, and gestured for her to enter. The room looked different in the morning light that filtered through a gap in the curtains. She could see details she had missed before. The intricate carvings on the bedposts, the faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene, the small table covered in vials and jars and instruments of medicine that had all failed, and in the center of it all, King Aldrich sat propped against his pillows, awake and waiting. His eyes found hers immediately, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. He had not slept either, she could tell. There were shadows beneath his eyes, dark as bruises, and his jaw was tight with exhaustion. But there was something else there too. Something that had not been present yesterday. A kind of resignation, as if he had spent the night wrestling with a decision and had finally, reluctantly, lost. "You came back," he said, and it was not quite a question, not quite a statement. "I told my guards to turn you away if you did. They disobeyed me." Mercia took 3 steps into the room and stopped, maintaining the distance between them like a careful negotiation. "Perhaps they know what you need better than you do, Your Majesty," she, said softly. Her heart was pounding so hard she wondered if he could hear it across the space that separated them. Perhaps they understand that some battles cannot be won alone. She watched his hands, saw the way they rested on top of the coverlet, palms down, as if he were trying to keep them from doing something against his will. The bandages had been changed, she noticed, but already there were small spots of red seeping through the white linen. "Do you know what they call me in the, villages?" the king asked suddenly, his voice rough. "The just king, Aldrich the Fair. They say I have never executed a man without proof of his crime, never taken land without cause, never turned away a petitioner who came to my gate seeking mercy." He laughed then, a sound so bitter it made Mercia's stomach turn. "They carve my name into stone and sing songs about my wisdom, and every word of it is a lie." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy as lead. Mercia felt her breath catch. In her throat, felt something shift in the room like the moment before a storm breaks. This was it, she realized. This was the moment her mother had known would come. The reason she had sent her daughter into the lion's den. "Tell me," she whispered, and she was no longer afraid. Fear had been replaced by something else, something that felt almost like hunger. The need to know, to understand, to carry the burden that was crushing this man into dust. King Aldrich closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. 12 years ago there was a man, a merchant from the eastern villages. He had a good reputation, paid his taxes, kept his family fed and sheltered. But there were whispers, rumors that he was meeting with nobles from the neighboring kingdom, that he was passing information about our defenses, our troop movements. He paused, and Mercia saw his throat work as he swallowed. "My advisors came to me with evidence. Letters, they said, written in his hand. Testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen him at the border. They told me that if I did not act, if I showed weakness, it would embolden our enemies, that more would die if I let one traitor live." Mercia's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to remain standing, forced herself to keep listening, even as dread began to crawl up her spine like ice. 12 years ago. She had been 4 years old 12 years ago, barely old enough to remember anything clearly. But there was something, a fragment of memory that lived in the back of her mind like a splinter she could never quite remove. Shouting, her mother's screams, men in armor dragging someone away while she hid behind her mother's skirts. "I ordered his execution," the king continued, and his eyes were still closed, as if he could not bear to see her reaction. "I did not question the evidence as thoroughly as I should have. I did not give him time to speak in his own defense, because my advisors said time was a luxury we could not afford. I signed the order, and 3 days later, he was hanged in the square for all to see. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms through the bandages. It was not until 6 months later that I learned the truth. The letters were forgeries. The witnesses had been bribed. The man was innocent, and I had killed him to satisfy the political ambitions of nobles who wanted to remove a merchant who had grown too successful, too influential." The room tilted, and Mercia had to reach out to steady herself against the wall. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together fragments of memory that suddenly made terrible sense. Her father had been a merchant. Her father had traveled to the castle when she was small and never came home. Her mother never spoke his name after that day, would not allow anyone to mention him, as if speaking of him would somehow make the loss more real. What was his name? Marcia heard herself ask, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. The man you killed. What was his name? King Aldrich's eyes opened, and in them she saw the answer before he spoke it. Saw the recognition dawning on his face as he truly looked at her for the first time. Saw the dark hair and gray eyes that must have reminded him of someone. Saw the age that would make her exactly 16 if her father had died 12 years ago. Thomas, he whispered, and the name fell between them like a stone into still water. His name was Thomas of Millbrook, and he left behind a wife and a daughter who would have been barely 4 years old. The world stopped. Everything stopped. Marcia could not breathe, could not think, could only stand there as the truth crashed over her in waves that threatened to drown her where she stood. The man lying before her, the man she had promised to help, the man whose pain she had felt in her own chest, was the murderer of her father. The king she was meant to save had destroyed her family, and he did not even know who she was. Marcia's knees gave out, and she hit the stone floor hard enough that pain shot up through her legs, but she barely felt it. The physical sensation was nothing compared to the roaring in her ears, the way her vision narrowed to a single point where King Aldrich sat frozen in his bed, his face gone white as the bandages wrapped around his arms. She could not speak, could not form words, could only kneel there on the cold floor while her entire world rearranged itself into something unrecognizable and horrible. Thomas of Millbrook. Her father's name had been Thomas. She knew this because once when she was 7 years old, she had found her mother crying in the garden, and through her tears, Ilara had whispered it like a prayer. "Thomas, forgive me. Thomas, I should have fought harder." Marcia had never asked what it meant, had learned early that some wounds were too deep to touch. But now she understood. Her mother had not been asking forgiveness for failing to save him. She had been asking forgiveness for surviving when he could not. "You," she managed to say, and the word came out strangled, barely human. "You killed my father." It was not a question. It was an accusation, a condemnation, a truth so large it seemed to fill the entire room until there was no space left for air. King Aldrich made a sound, something between a gasp and a moan, and tried to sit up straighter, but his body would not cooperate. He looked suddenly smaller, older, as if her words had physically aged him. "I did not know," he said, and his voice cracked. "God in heaven, I did not know who you were. Your mother, Ilara. She did not use his name when she became known in the villages. She was just called the listener. And I never made the connection." His hands were shaking violently now, and fresh blood seeped through the bandages where his nails had found purchase in his own flesh. "If I had known, I would never have summoned you here. I would never have made you face this." But he had summoned her. That was the cruelty of it, the cosmic joke that made Marcia want to laugh and scream in equal measure. Fate or God or whatever force moved through the world had brought her here, to this room, to sit across from the man who had signed her father's death warrant, and listen to him confess his sins like she was a priest who could grant absolution. "My mother knew," Marcia heard herself say, and the realization struck her like a fist to the stomach. "When she sent me here, she knew who you were. She knew what you had done." The thought was almost worse than everything else. Her mother, who had raised her with gentle hands and soft words, who had taught her that healing came from understanding and forgiveness, had sent her into this trap, had placed her 16-year-old daughter in a room with her father's killer and told her to save him. Why? What possible reason could justify such cruelty? Unless Ilara believed that. This was the only way to heal the wound that had festered in their family for 12 years. Unless she thought that by forcing Marcia to see King Aldrich as a human being first, as a suffering soul before a murderer, She could break the cycle of hatred that would otherwise consume them both. "Get out," Mercia said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was not talking to the king. She was talking to herself, to the part of her that wanted to run from this room and never look back, to return to the village and pretend none of this had ever happened. But her body would not move. Her legs remained folded beneath her on the cold stone, and her eyes stayed fixed on King Aldric's face, memorizing every line of guilt etched into his features. This was the man who had made her mother a widow. This was the man who had stolen her father's last breath. And he was dying because the weight of it was crushing him from the inside out. "I have carried this for 12 years, the king said, quietly, and now tears were running down his face, cutting tracks through the gray pallor of his skin. "Every night I see his face, Thomas's face. I see him standing in the square with the rope around his neck, and I see the moment when he stopped struggling, when the life left his eyes. And I know that I put him there. Not the nobles who lied to me, not the advisors who pushed me to act quickly. Me. I made the choice. I signed the paper. I am the one who killed an innocent man." Mercia felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid since the moment she learned the truth. It was not forgiveness, not understanding, but something more terrible. It was recognition. She saw, with horrible clarity, that King Aldric was not some monster who had killed without conscience. He was a man who had made a mistake, a catastrophic mistake, and who had been destroyed by it just as surely as her father had been destroyed by the rope. The wounds on his arms were not mysterious. They were not some plague or curse. They were his body trying to punish itself for a crime his soul could not forgive. "You want to die," she said, and it was not a question. "That is why you scratch yourself in your sleep. Your mind will not let you rest until you have paid for what you did, and the only payment it will accept is your own life." The king's eyes closed, fresh tears squeezing out from beneath his lids, and she knew she was right. "But death is too easy, Your Majesty. Death is what cowards choose when they cannot bear to live with what they have done." The words were cruel, and she meant them to be. She wanted him to hurt the way she was hurting, wanted him to feel the full weight of what he had taken from her. But even as she spoke, she felt her mother's presence in the room, as if Alara were standing behind her, guiding her tongue. This was why she had been sent here, not to avenge her father, but to force King Aldric to live, to make him face each day, knowing what he had done, to carry that burden until his natural death, because that was the only real penance. Death was escape. Life was punishment. "I will help you," Mercia said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I will cure your wounds and stop your hands from tearing your own flesh. But not because you deserve it, not because I forgive you. I will help you because my father was a good man, and he would not want his death to be the cause of another, even yours. And because if you die now, easy and quick in your bed, you will never truly understand what you took from us." King Aldric's eyes opened, and in them she saw something that looked like hope, dying. Good, she thought viciously. Let it die. Let him live every day without hope, the way her mother had lived for 12 years. Let him wake each morning and remember that he breathes while Thomas of Millbrook does not. "What must I do?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "To be cured. What must I do?" Mercia stood slowly, her legs shaking, and moved closer to his bed. She reached out and took his bandaged hands in hers, feeling the tremors that ran through them, the desperate need to destroy that lived in his fingertips. "You must forgive yourself," she said, and her voice was steady now, cold and clear as winter water. "And that, Your Majesty, is something I cannot help you do. That is a journey you must take alone." The days that followed moved like honey, thick and slow and suffocating. Mercia returned to the king's chamber each morning as the sun rose over the castle walls, and each morning she found him waiting, his eyes fixed on the door as if he had been watching for her all night. They did not speak of her father again, but his ghost filled the space between them, a presence so solid that sometimes Mercia felt she could reach out and touch the shape of him in the air. She began the way her mother had taught her, with silence. She would sit in the chair beside his bed, close enough that he could see her face clearly and simply exist in the same space as his pain. The first day, King Aldrich could not meet her eyes for more than a few seconds before looking away. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. The second day, he managed a full minute before the shame drove his gaze back to the ceiling. By the third day, something had shifted. He looked at her and did not look away, and in his eyes she saw the beginning of something that might have been acceptance. Not of forgiveness, but of the fact that she was there, that she had chosen to stay, that she had not fled back to her village and left him to rot in his guilt. On the fourth morning, she brought supplies. Clean linen torn into strips, a bowl of water mixed with crushed lavender and chamomile, a salve made from honey and yarrow that her mother had taught her to prepare. King Aldrich watched her arrange these items on the small table beside his bed, his expression unreadable. "You said, 'I must forgive myself,'" he said quietly. "But you bring medicine for my wounds. I do not understand." Mercia dipped a clean cloth into the herbed water, wringing it out until it no longer dripped. "The body and the soul are connected," she said, reaching for his right arm. He flinched when she touched him but did not pull away. "When we hurt inside, it shows on our skin, but sometimes we must heal the skin first before we can reach the hurt beneath." She began to unwrap the soiled bandages, working slowly and carefully. The wounds beneath were worse than she had imagined. Deep scratches that had become infected, the flesh around them red and swollen, some of them weeping clear fluid that spoke of fever and poison. Her hands did not shake as she cleaned each wound, even though her stomach turned at the sight of what he had done to himself. She had seen illness before, had helped her mother treat burns and cuts and broken bones, but there was something uniquely horrible about injuries that were self-inflicted. Each scratch was an accusation written in blood, each torn piece of flesh a word in a sentence that said, "I deserve this, I deserve this, I deserve this." "Does it hurt?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Yes," King Aldrich said, and his voice was steady, but not as much as it should. There was something in his tone that made her pause, made her finally raise her eyes to his face. He was watching her hands move across his skin with an expression that looked almost like wonder. "You are so gentle," he said softly, "even knowing what I did, even hating me as you must. Your touch is gentle." Mercia felt anger flare hot in her chest, sudden and fierce. "Do not mistake gentleness for forgiveness," she said sharply, pressing a little harder than necessary as she applied the honey salve to a particularly deep scratch. He hissed in pain, but she did not apologize. "I am gentle because that is who I am, who my mother raised me to be, not because you have earned it." She wrapped fresh bandages around his arm, pulling them tight, and moved to his left side to repeat the process. "You want me to hate you. You want me to hurt you. Because that would be easier than this, would it not? Easier than being cared for by the daughter of the man you murdered." The word hung between them, sharp as a blade. Murdered. She had not used it before, had danced around it with softer language, but now she wanted him to hear it, to feel the full weight of what he had done. King Aldrich's breath caught, and when she looked at his face, she saw that he was crying again. Silent tears that ran down into his beard, dampening the collar of his nightshirt. "I do not want your care," he whispered. "I do not deserve your care. Every time you touch me, every time you show me mercy, it is another wound, deeper than any I could inflict on myself." "Good," Mercia said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Then feel it. Let it cut you. Let it remind you. Every moment that you are alive and my father is not. That you lie in a soft bed while he lies in cold ground. That you have the luxury of guilt while he has nothing at all." She finished wrapping his left arm and sat back, her hands trembling now that the work was done. You asked what you must do to be cured. This is it. You must sit with the pain of being forgiven by someone who should never forgive you. You must accept care from hands that have every right to harm you. You must live knowing that you are receiving a gift you can never repay and do not deserve. King Aldrich closed his eyes, and his whole body seemed to collapse inward, as if her words had broken something fundamental in his structure. "I cannot do this," he said, and his voice was barely audible. "I cannot bear it. The weight of it. The knowledge that every breath I take is a breath stolen from him, from your family. How do you expect me to live with that?" Mercia stood and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to let in the afternoon light. The sun was bright, almost painfully so, and it fell across the stone floor in a golden rectangle that looked like a door to somewhere else, somewhere better. "My mother has lived with it for 12 years, she said without turning around. "She has risen every morning knowing that the man she loved was gone, that her daughter would grow up without a father, that the king who killed him still sat on his throne giving orders and making laws. And she did not let it destroy her. She chose to heal others instead. She chose to turn her pain into something useful. She turned back to face him, and the light behind her made her a silhouette, a dark figure haloed in gold. If she can do that, then you can do this. You can accept my care. You can stop tearing your own flesh. You can live long enough to make amends, even if those amends are nothing more than breathing each day and remembering his name." She moved back to the chair and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "Tomorrow we will talk about the dreams, the nightmares that wake you, and you will tell me everything you see, everything you feel, until there are no secrets left between us." King Aldrich opened his eyes and looked at her, and in his gaze she saw something new. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. Something that looked like the faintest possibility that perhaps there was a way through this darkness that did not end in death. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this? You could let me die. No one would blame you. You could walk away and let nature take its course, and your father would be avenged." Mercia felt her throat tighten, felt the tears she had been holding back since the moment she learned the truth finally begin to rise. "Because he was a good man," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "And good men do not raise daughters who let people suffer, even when those people deserve it." The nightmares began to spill from King Aldrich's lips like poison from a wound, dark and thick and terrible. Mercia sat in her chair as the afternoon light faded to dusk, then to full darkness, and listened to him describe the dreams that had haunted him for 12 years. In them, Thomas of Millbrook did not die quickly. In them, the rope broke and he fell to the platform, his neck twisted but not severed, and he lay there gasping and choking while the crowd watched in horrified silence. In them, King Aldrich stood at the edge of the square and could not look away, could not give the order to end it mercifully, could only watch as the man who had done nothing wrong struggled for breath that would not come. "Sometimes," the king whispered, his voice hoarse from talking, "sometimes in the dream, he looks at me, and his eyes are not angry. They are sad, disappointed, like a father looking at a son who has failed him utterly." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "That is worse than rage. Rage I could understand. Rage I deserve. But that look, that terrible sadness, it follows me even after I wake. I see it in every face, in every mirror. I see it in your eyes." Mercia felt something twist in her chest, something that was not quite sympathy, but was dangerously close to it. She fought against it, reminded herself that this man had destroyed her family, that his suffering was nothing compared to what he had inflicted. But the fight was becoming harder with each passing day, with each moment she spent in this room, watching him slowly come apart. "You never saw my father," she said carefully, testing the words on her tongue. "You never looked at his face before you signed the order, did you?" King Aldrich's silence was answer enough. He turned his head away, staring at the wall as if he could see through stone to something beyond. "I saw a name on parchment," he finally said. Thomas of Millbrook, merchant, accused of treason. I saw the seal of my advisors, men I trusted. I saw the urgency in their eyes, the insistence that delay would mean more deaths, would mean showing weakness to our enemies. And I signed. His hands clenched into fists, and Mercia saw him consciously stop himself from digging his nails into his palms. I did not ask to see him. I did not ask to hear his defense. I simply signed my name and sent a man to his death, and I never once looked at his face. The admission hung in the darkness between them, and Mercia felt her carefully constructed walls of hatred beginning to crack. Because this was the heart of it. Not malice, not cruelty, but cowardice. The kind of everyday cowardice that let good people do terrible things because it was easier than confronting the complexity of truth. King Aldrich had not set out to murder an innocent man. He had simply failed to be brave enough to question, to investigate, to demand proof beyond the word of men who had their own agendas. And that failure had cost her father his life. "Tell me about him," the king said. Suddenly, his voice rough with need. "Tell me about Thomas. Not the man in my nightmares, but the real man. The father you remember." It was the first time he had asked her for anything, and the request felt like a physical blow. Mercia's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment she could not speak. To talk about her father was to make him real again, to bring him into this room where his killer lay dying of guilt. It felt like a betrayal, but it also felt necessary, like the final piece of a ritual that had to be completed before either of them could move forward. "I was 4 years old when he died," she began slowly, the words coming with difficulty, like drawing water from a nearly dry well. "I do not remember much, but I remember his laugh. It was loud and deep, and it made his whole body shake. He would pick me up and spin me around until I was dizzy and screaming with joy." She closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. "He brought me things from his travels. A wooden horse once carved with such detail that you could see each individual hair of its mane. A length of blue ribbon that I wore in my hair until it fell apart from use. A strange fruit from the south that tasted like sunshine." She opened her eyes and found King Aldrich watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. There was hunger in his gaze, a desperate need to know the man he had killed, as if learning about Thomas could somehow undo what had been done. "He was teaching me to read," she continued, her voice stronger now. "My mother says that was unusual for a merchant's daughter, but he insisted. He would sit with me by the fire each evening and trace the letters in soot on a piece of slate, making me repeat them until I knew them by heart. A, B, C, D. I got to M before he left for the castle that last time." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of King Aldrich's ragged breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it. "What was the last thing he said to you, before he left?" The question felt invasive, too personal, but Mercia found herself answering anyway, compelled by something she did not fully understand. "He kissed my forehead and told me to be good for my mother," she said, and now the tears were coming, hot and fast, running down her cheeks in streams she made no effort to stop. "He said he would be back in 3 days, and we would finish learning the alphabet together. He promised me. He promised." The words dissolved into sobs, great heaving gasps that shook her entire body. She had not cried like this since she was a child, had learned to keep her grief locked away where it could not hurt her, but now it came pouring out like a flood through broken gates. She felt movement, and realized through her tears that King Aldrich had pushed himself upright in bed, was reaching toward her with bandaged hands. "Do not touch me," she said sharply, jerking back, and he froze, his arm extended in the space between them. They stayed like that for a long moment, both of them crying now, both of them drowning in the weight of what had been lost and could never be recovered. "I am sorry," King Aldrich said, and the words were so inadequate, so pathetically small compared to the enormity of what he was apologizing for, that they almost made her angry again. "I know those words mean nothing. I know they cannot bring him back or give you back those days you lost. The father who should have taught you the rest of the alphabet and walked you down the aisle on your wedding day and held your children in his arms. I know, but I am sorry. I am so deeply, impossibly sorry. Marcia wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to regain some semblance of composure. My mother finished teaching me to read, she said, her voice still thick with tears. It took her 2 years because every time we sat down with the slate, she would start crying and have to stop. But she did it. She made sure I learned every letter, every word, because he had wanted that for me. She stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy that was coursing through her body like lightning. That is what your guilt cost us. Not just his life, but years of my mother's life spent trying to hold together the pieces of what you broke. King Aldrich lay back against his pillows, and she saw that his face had gone gray again, that the brief animation that had come with their conversation was fading. The wounds, he said quietly, they have stopped bleeding as much since you began caring for them, since I began to speak the truth aloud. He looked at his bandaged arms with something like wonder. I thought the only cure was death, but perhaps there is another way. Marcia felt her heart rate slow, felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The body reflects the soul, she said, repeating her mother's words. When we stop fighting ourselves, when we stop trying to destroy what we cannot bear to live with, the healing can begin. She moved back to her chair and sat down, suddenly exhausted. But do not mistake this for forgiveness, Your Majesty. Your wounds may heal, but that does not erase what you did. It only means you are strong enough now to live with it. 3 weeks passed, and the castle began to whisper. Servants talked in corners about the young healer who spent hours each day in the king's chamber, about how His Majesty had stopped. Screaming in his sleep about how the royal physicians had been dismissed one by one until only she remained. The whispers reached Marcia's ears as she walked the corridors, fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she drew near. The girl from nowhere. The peasant with her strange methods. Some said she was a miracle worker. Others suggested darker things, spoke in hushed tones about witchcraft and unnatural influence. Marcia tried to ignore them, tried to focus only on the work. Before her, King Aldrich's wounds were healing, slowly but undeniably. The angry red inflammation had faded to pink, and new skin was beginning to form over the deepest scratches. More importantly, he had stopped tearing at himself in his sleep. She had taught him techniques her mother used with the grief-stricken and the tormented, ways of breathing that calmed the mind, prayers not to God but to the self, affirmations spoken aloud in the darkness. I am alive. I am here. I will face tomorrow. Simple words, but they seemed to work where medicine had failed. But as his body healed, something else was happening. Something Marcia had not anticipated and did not know how to stop. King Aldrich was beginning to look at her differently. It started small, with glances that lasted a moment too long, with the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply grateful for her care, that any patient might develop affection for their healer. But then came the morning when she arrived to find fresh flowers on the table beside his bed, wild flowers from the castle gardens arranged in a simple clay vase. I asked the gardener to cut them, he said when he saw her staring. You spend so many hours in this dark room with me. I thought perhaps you might like something beautiful to look at. His cheeks flushed slightly, and Marcia felt her stomach drop. This was dangerous. This was territory she had not prepared for, had not even considered. Possible. How could he? How could he possibly think that there could be anything between them beyond this terrible mission of healing and penance? Your Majesty, she said carefully, deliberately using his title to create distance. I appreciate the gesture, but it is not necessary. I am here to help you recover, nothing more. She moved to her usual chair, but today it felt too close. The space between them suddenly charged with something that made her skin prickle with discomfort. King Aldrich sat up straighter, and she saw determination settle over his features like a mask. Marcia, he said, and the way he spoke her name, soft and full of meaning, made her want to flee the room. These past weeks, you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Not just healing for my body, but hope. The possibility that perhaps I am not beyond redemption, that perhaps there is a path forward even for someone who has done what I have done. He paused, and she could see him gathering courage for whatever he was about to say next. I find myself thinking of you when you are not here, wondering what you are doing, if you are safe, if you are happy. I find myself counting the hours until you return each morning. No, 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 no. Marcia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor with a sound like a scream. Stop, she said, and her voice was sharp enough to cut. Whatever you think you are feeling, whatever you believe this is, you are wrong. I am the daughter of the man you murdered. The daughter. Do you understand what that means? There can never, never be anything between us except this work, this healing. To suggest otherwise is obscene. But King Aldrich did not look away, did not retreat into shame as she expected. Instead, he met her gaze with an openness that was somehow worse than any declaration of love could have been. I know who you are, he said quietly. I have not forgotten for a single moment. But perhaps that is exactly why this matters. Perhaps the only way to truly atone for taking a life is to dedicate your own life to honoring what was lost, to protecting and caring for those who were left behind. Marcia felt bile rise in her throat. You think you can atone by what? Marrying me? By making me your queen and pretending that somehow balances the scales? The laugh that escaped her was bitter and harsh. You killed my father, and now you want to take his daughter as some kind of payment? As if I am a debt to be settled. She was shaking now, her whole body trembling with a rage so pure it felt like it might consume her from the inside out. That is not what I meant, King Aldrich said. And now there was pain in his voice, hurt that he had no right to feel. I do not see you as payment or debt. I see you as the most extraordinary person I have ever known. You, who had every reason to let me die, chose instead to save me. You, who should hate me with every fiber of your being, showed me mercy. How can I not love someone capable of that kind of strength? The word hung in the air between them. Love. He had said it, had named the thing that Marcia had been trying desperately not to acknowledge, because to acknowledge it was to give it power. You do not love me, she said, and her voice was cold now, frozen solid with the need to end this conversation before it destroyed everything. You love the idea of redemption that I represent. You love the possibility that if I can forgive you, then perhaps you can forgive yourself. But I am not your salvation, Your Majesty. I am just a girl trying to honor her mother's wishes and keep a broken man from bleeding to death. She saw the words land like blows, saw King Aldrich flinch with each one. Good, she thought viciously. Let him hurt. Let him understand that some lines cannot be crossed. Some wounds cannot be healed with pretty speeches and flower arrangements. I will continue to care for your wounds, she said, her voice steady now, despite the chaos in her heart. I will continue to help you sleep through the night without tearing your own flesh. But if you speak of this again, if you make any further suggestion that there could be something between us, I will leave this castle and you will never see me again. Do you understand? King Aldrich nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I understand. Forgive me. I should not have. I had no right. He lay back against his pillows, suddenly looking older. Again, the brief animation that had lit his features during his confession now extinguished completely. You are right. About all of it. I was trying to make this into something it could never be, trying to transform penance into something easier to bear. Marcia should have felt victorious, should have felt satisfied that she had drawn the line so firmly, had reminded him of the unbridgeable chasm that separated them. But instead, she felt only emptiness, a hollowness that seemed to echo in her chest like a drum, because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, something had shifted in her as well. Somewhere between the nightmare confessions and the gentle unwrapping of bandages, between the tears and the silences, she had begun to see King Aldrich not as a monster, but as a man. A deeply flawed, desperately broken man who was trying, however inadequately, to be better than he had been. And that realization terrified her more than anything else ever had. Because if he was not a monster, if he was simply human, capable of terrible mistakes, but also of genuine remorse, then what did that make her? What did it say about her that some small, traitorous part of her heart had softened toward him despite everything? She left the room without another word, closing the door behind her with a gentleness that belied the storm raging inside her mind. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, trying to catch her breath. Mercia did not return to the king's chamber the next morning. She told herself it was because he needed to learn to manage without her constant presence, that part of healing was developing independence from the healer. But the truth she could barely admit, even to herself, was that she was afraid of what she might say if he looked at her with those desperate, hopeful eyes again. Afraid of what she might feel if he spoke her name in that soft voice that made something inside her chest tighten. Painfully. She spent the day in the castle gardens instead, sitting on a stone bench beneath an apple tree that was just beginning to bloom. The air smelled of spring and new growth, of things that had survived the winter and were brave enough to reach toward the sun again. She thought about her mother, wondered what Elara would say if she could see her daughter now, caught in this impossible web of duty and confusion, and something that felt dangerously like understanding. Had her mother known this would happen? Had she sent Mercia here knowing that proximity to King Aldrich's suffering would make it harder to maintain the clear lines of hatred? The captain of the guard found her there as the sun reached its peak. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and when Mercia looked up, she saw concern etched into his scarred face. "The king is asking for you," he said without preamble. "He has not eaten today, will not let anyone else tend to his wounds. He just sits there staring at the wall, and forgive me for saying this, but I am worried he is slipping back into whatever darkness you pulled him from." Guilt crashed over Mercia like a wave. She had been so caught up in her own turmoil that she had not considered what her absence might mean to him, how fragile his recovery still was. "I will go to him," she said, standing quickly and brushing flower petals from her dress. The captain nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. But as she moved past him, he caught her arm gently. "Whatever happened between you," he said quietly, "whatever words were spoken, the king is a good man. Not perfect, God knows, but good. He carries his mistakes like stones around his neck, and before you came, I thought they would drag him under and drown him." His grip tightened slightly, urgent. "You gave him a reason to breathe again. Do not take that away unless you are certain it is the right thing to do." Mercia pulled her arm free, more roughly than she intended, and walked toward the castle without responding. How dare he, she thought angrily. How dare any of them think they understood what she was going through, the impossible position she had been placed in. But beneath the anger was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Because the captain was right. King Aldrich was fragile, and she had known that. And she had left him alone anyway because her own feelings were too complicated to navigate. When she entered his chamber, she found him exactly as the captain had described. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in his nightshirt, though it was well past noon, staring at nothing. His hands rested on his knees, and she could see through the bandages that some of the wounds had reopened, small spots of red blooming through the white linen like poppies in snow. He did not look up when she entered, did not seem to register her presence at all. "Your Majesty," she said softly, and the title felt wrong in her mouth now, too formal for what had passed between them. He turned his head slowly, and when his eyes found hers, she saw that he had been crying. Not the dramatic tears of their earlier conversations, but the quiet kind that left tracks on cheeks and made eyes red and swollen. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "I should not have stayed away. That was cruel of me." King Aldrich shook his head slowly, a movement that seemed to take great effort. "You have nothing to apologize for. I am the one who overstepped, who tried to turn something sacred into something selfish." His voice was rough, unused. I have been thinking all day about what you said, about how I was seeking redemption through you, using you as a path to self-forgiveness. And you were right. You were absolutely right. He looked down at his hands, at the fresh blood seeping through the bandages. I did this last night, not unconsciously in my sleep, but awake, fully aware, because I thought perhaps, if I punished myself enough, you might come back. The admission made Mercia's heart clench with an emotion she could not name. That is not how this works, she said, moving closer despite every instinct telling her to maintain distance. Punishment is not the same as penance. Hurting yourself does not undo the hurt you caused others. She knelt before him, taking his hands in hers, feeling the warmth of fresh blood through the fabric. Let me see. She unwrapped the bandages with practiced efficiency, and what she found beneath made her breath catch in her throat. The wounds were deeper than before, more deliberate. These were not the frantic scratches of a sleeping man tortured by nightmares. These were calculated, methodical, carved with intention. You did this to yourself on purpose, she said, and it was not a question. You sat here alone in the darkness and tore open your own flesh because why? To prove something, to show me you are suffering, to remind myself of what I am, King Aldrich said quietly. A man who destroys things, who ruins everything he touches. I thought for a moment that perhaps I could be different, that perhaps your presence in my life meant I was capable of change, of being better. But I was wrong. I'm still the same man who signed an innocent person's death warrant. Still the coward who did not have the courage to look Thomas in the eye before I killed him. Mercia felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was not the time for her own emotions. You are not the same man, she said firmly, beginning to clean the wounds with hands that trembled slightly. The same man would not remember my father's name, would not speak it with reverence, would not carry the weight of what he did every single day. She applied fresh salve, her movements gentle despite the anger churning in her stomach. The same man would have found a way to justify it, to convince himself he did what was necessary. But you have let it break you open. And that is the difference between a monster and a man. King Aldrich looked at her then, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a question forming, something dangerous and fragile. Do you truly believe that? He asked. That I am capable of being better than I was? Or are you simply saying what you think will keep me from harming myself again? The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable, like watching someone stand naked in the snow. Mercia opened her mouth to respond with something safe, something that would maintain the boundaries she had so carefully established. But the words that came out were not safe at all. I believe that people are not their worst moments, she said slowly, wrapping fresh bandages around his arms with infinite care. I believe that my father, who was a good man, would want me to see you as you are now, not just as who you were 12 years ago. And I believe, God help me, I believe that healing you has somehow begun to heal something in me as well. The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any declaration of love could have been. King Aldrich's breath caught, and she saw hope flare in his eyes, dangerous and bright. Mercia, he said, and her name on his lips felt like a prayer. I do not deserve your compassion. I do not deserve to be in the same room as you, breathing the same air. But I swear to you, I swear on everything I hold sacred, that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy you have shown me. Mercia finished tying the bandages and sat back on her heels, looking up at him. Then start by not hurting yourself, she said. Because every time you do, every time you tear open your own flesh, you dishonor the work we have done together. You dishonor the possibility that people can change, can grow, can become better than their worst sins. She stood slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling on the hard stone. And you dishonor my father's memory, because he would not want his death to be the reason another man destroys himself, even if that man was responsible for it. 6 months passed like water through fingers, each day bleeding into the next until Mercia could no longer remember what her life had been like before the castle. before King Aldrich, before the weight of impossible choices had settled permanently on her shoulders. The king's wounds had healed completely, leaving only faint silver scars that caught the light. When he moved his arms, he slept through the nights now without nightmares, or at least without the kind that made him tear at his own flesh. But something else had taken root in the space where his self-destruction had lived, something neither of them knew how to name. The castle had noticed. Of course they had noticed. Servants whispered about how the king laughed now, how color had returned to his cheeks, how he walked the corridors with purpose instead of shuffling like a man already half dead. They whispered too about the young healer who had accomplished what no physician could, who spent hours each day in private council with His Majesty, who had somehow become essential to the functioning of the kingdom without ever being given an official title or position. Mercia stood at the window of her small chamber, watching the sun set over the castle walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple that hurt to look at. In her hands, she held a letter that had arrived that morning from her mother. The parchment was rough beneath her fingers, the ink slightly smudged as if Alara had been crying as she wrote. "My dearest daughter," it began, "I know what you must think of me. I know you must wonder why I sent you to him, knowing what he had done, knowing the pain it would cause you to sit beside your father's murderer and call it healing." Mercia had read the letter 7 times already, memorizing every word, every loop of her mother's careful script. "But I need you to understand something, my child. Hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that carries it. I have watched it eat away at good people, turning them hollow and bitter until there is nothing left but rage. When I learned that the king was dying of guilt, that his own conscience was killing him, I saw a chance, not for revenge, but for something rarer. I saw the possibility that perhaps both of you could be freed from the chains that bound you to that terrible day 12 years ago." A knock at her door interrupted her reading. She folded the letter quickly and tucked it into her pocket before calling out permission to enter. King Aldrich stood in the doorway, and the sight of him still sometimes took her breath away, not because he was handsome, though he had become that again as health returned to his body, but because of what he represented. The living proof that people could survive their worst mistakes, could carry unbearable guilt and still find reasons to wake. Each morning, "I am leaving tomorrow," he said without preamble, and Mercia felt her heart drop into her stomach. "There is something I must do, something I should have done 12 years ago." He stepped into the room, and she noticed he was dressed for travel, in simple clothes without any royal insignia. "I am going to Millbrook, to the village where your father lived, where he is buried. And I am going to stand before his grave and speak his name aloud, and tell him that I am sorry, that I failed him, that his daughter saved the life of the man who took his." Mercia could not speak, could not form words around the lump that had suddenly formed in her throat. This was what she had wanted, was it not? For him to face the full reality of what he had done, to confront it not in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of a grave marker and a grieving community. But the thought of him going there, of the villagers who had known her father seeing the king who had killed him, filled her with a terror she could not explain. "I will come with you," she heard herself say, and King Aldrich's eyes widened with surprise. "Not because you need me there, but because I need to be there. I need to see you stand before his grave. I need to hear you speak his name in the place where he was loved, where he mattered, where he was more than just a name on a death warrant." She moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the faint scar on his left forearm, one of the first wounds she had treated. "And I need to introduce you properly, not as the king, but as Aldrich, the man who made a terrible mistake and has spent every day since trying to understand the weight of it." They left at dawn, just the two of them on horseback, riding through countryside that was green with summer growth. King Aldrich had insisted on no guards, no royal procession, nothing that would announce his presence. They were simply 2 travelers on a road that wound through fields of wheat and past farmhouses where smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals. They did not speak much during the journey, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It had become something else, something that felt almost like understanding. Millbrook appeared in the distance as the sun reached its zenith, a small village clustered around a stone church with a bell tower that reached toward the sky like a prayer. Mercia felt her chest tighten as they approached, memories flooding back, with an intensity that made her dizzy. She had been so young when they left this place, fleeing to a different village where her mother could start over, where people did not know them as the family of the executed traitor. But she remembered the cobblestone streets, the well in the center of the square, the bakery that always smelled of fresh bread. They found the graveyard behind the church, a quiet place where wildflowers grew between the markers. Mercia led him to a simple stone, weathered by 12 years of rain and sun, that bore only a name and 2 dates. Thomas of Millbrook, beloved husband and father. King Aldrich stood before it for a long moment, and Mercia saw his hands begin to shake. She reached out and took his right hand in hers, lacing their fingers together, and felt him grip her tightly, as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Thomas," he said, and his voice broke on the name. "I do not know if you can hear me, wherever you are. I do not know if the dead can see the living, or if they care about the apologies of those who wronged them. But I need to say this anyway. I need to tell you that I am sorry, that I was a coward and a fool, and that my cowardice cost you everything. Cost your wife the man she loved, cost your daughter the father she needed, cost the world a good man it could not afford to lose." Tears were streaming down his face now, and Mercia found that she was crying too, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "I cannot undo what I did," King Aldrich continued. "I cannot bring you back or give your family the years they lost. But I swear to you, I swear on everything I am and everything I hope to become, that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man you were, the kind of man who deserved to live, who deserved to teach his daughter the rest of the alphabet and watch her grow into the extraordinary woman she has become." He turned to Mercia then, still holding her hand, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart ache with its intensity. Not love, exactly, or at least not the romantic kind that poets wrote about. Something deeper than that, more complicated, a connection forged in the crucible of shared pain and impossible forgiveness. "Your daughter saved my life," he said, speaking now to the grave as if Thomas could truly hear. "Not just my body, but my soul. She gave me a reason to live when all I wanted was to die, and I do not deserve that gift, will never deserve it, but I will honor it. I will honor her, and through her, I will honor you." Mercia squeezed his hand tightly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. "Papa," she said, using the word she had not spoken in 12 years. "This is Aldrich. He made a terrible mistake, but he is trying to be better. And I think you would want me to help him, because that is what you taught me, is it not? That people are more than their worst moments, that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand before the grave, while the sun moved across the sky and birds sang in the trees overhead. When they finally turned to leave, Mercia felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock opening, like a door that had been sealed shut suddenly swinging wide. She did not know what would happen next, did not know if she could ever truly forgive him, or if forgiveness was even the right word for what was growing between them. But she knew with absolute certainty that they would face whatever came together. Two people bound by tragedy, choosing against all odds to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Mercia stood at the crossroads between justice and mercy, between the hatred she had every right to feel and the compassion that terrified her to her core. She could have let King Aldrich die, could have walked away and called it righteous revenge. But instead, she chose the harder path, the one that required her to see her father's killer as a human being capable of remorse, capable of change. And in doing so, she discovered that healing others sometimes means healing the parts of ourselves we didn't even know were broken. So ask yourself this: if you were in her place, Could you have done the same? Could you have sat beside the person who destroyed your family and chosen understanding over hatred? Could you have held the hand that signed your father's death warrant and called it mercy? The truth is, we are all carrying wounds we inflict on ourselves, guilt that eats us alive, mistakes we cannot undo. And sometimes, the only path to redemption is through the very people we have hurt the most. Mercia and Aldrich's story reminds us that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing the unforgivable. It is about refusing to let the worst moments of someone's life define them forever. It is about choosing, against all odds, to believe that people can be more than their sins. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you would do in an impossible situation, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that will challenge your heart and change the way you see the world. Because stories like these, stories that force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters are just broken people, are the ones we need most. Thank you for listening, and remember, the heaviest chains we carry are the ones we forge ourselves.